It wasn't a failure of capitalism. It wasn't a sudden unpredictable act of nature or bad luck. It wasn't even the result of political incompetence or the accidental blunder of a well-meaning administration. It was a mathematical inevitability engineered by design. Deep in the archives of American financial history, there is a singular turning point, a moment, where the trajectory of the nation was altered not by a vote, not by a war, and not by a popular revolution, but by the quiet, calculated decisions of a specific archetype, a figure who operates in the shadows of the marble columns, whose name rarely appears in the headlines, but whose fingerprints are on every dollar in your pocket and every debt in your ledger. We are told that the economy is a complex, untamable beast moving in mysterious cycles that no one can truly control. We are told that inflation, recessions, and the erosion of the middle class are just the weather patterns of the modern world, but the arithmetic tells a different story. The arithmetic is merciless, and the pattern is unmistakable. This is not a story about a single villain twirling a mustache. It is a story about a system, a mechanism of wealth transfer, so elegant, so slow, and so pervasive that it becomes invisible to the very people it is dismantling. It is a story about the man, or rather the specific, role that crippled the foundational promise of American prosperity. But to understand the scale of what has happened, to truly grasp the mechanics of this silent engine, we cannot just look at the ticker tape of the New York Stock Exchange or the minutes of the Federal Reserve. We have to look back. We have to look at the graveyards of empires that walked this path before us, because this has happened. Before the pattern repeats, the incentives are identical, and the outcome is always the same. We will examine the evidence through three distinct historical lenses. First, we will travel to the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically the period between the reign of Nero and the crisis of the 3rd century, to see how the debasement of currency destroyed the first global superpower. Next, we will analyze the Weimar Republic in Germany between 1914 and 1923, dissecting the mechanics of hyperinflation and the obliteration of the prudent saver. Finally, we will study the British Empire from 1914 to the 1970s, witnessing the slow, agonizing death of the sterling as the world as reserve currency. In each case, you will see the same sequence: peak dominance, unsustainable imperial costs, a monetary shortcut chosen by the elite, inflation, social fracture, and finally, a reset. Just like Rome, the United States is facing a crisis of arithmetic. Just like Weimar, the printing press has become the primary tool of policy. Just like Britain, the privilege of the reserve currency is being stretched to its breaking point. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages, and current data suggest we are already deep into the final chapters. Let us begin with the first case study, the Roman Empire, the archetype of Western power. For centuries, the Roman denarius was the standard of value across the known world. It was a silver coin, pure and reliable. A soldier in the legions knew exactly what he was fighting for. A merchant in Antioch knew exactly what he was selling for. The system worked because the money was honest, but empires are expensive. Legions need to be paid. Roads need to be maintained. The bureaucracy inevitably begins to swell. And eventually, the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the revenue it can generate through taxation. This is the trap. This is the moment where the man, the central planner, the imperial treasurer, makes a fatal decision. He realizes that raising taxes is politically dangerous. It invites rebellion. It invites scrutiny. But there is another way. A way to pay the bills without anyone noticing, at least not at first. In 64 AD, the Emperor Nero faced a budget crisis. The Great Fire of Rome had devastated the city. The costs of rebuilding were astronomical. The treasury was strained. Nero's solution was simple, brilliant, and catastrophic. He ordered the mint to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 100% to roughly 90%. He also slightly reduced the size of the coin. With the leftover silver, he could mint more coins. He could pay the soldiers. He could rebuild the palaces. And on the surface, nothing had changed. The coin looked the same. It carried the same face of the emperor. It had the same name, but its soul had been corrupted. The incentive was clear: solve the immediate liquidity crisis by stealing value from the future. For a time it worked. The economy boomed. Money was flowing. But the seal had been broken. Once the precedent was set that the currency could be altered by decree, the discipline was gone. Fast forward to the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. Even he, a man of stoic virtue, could not resist the mathematical pressure. By his time, the silver content had dropped to around 75%. Wars on the frontier were costly. The plague had reduced the tax base. The easy lever was pulled again. Then came Septimius Severus in the late 2nd century. He needed to buy the loyalty of the army. He raised soldiers' pay by 50%. How did he pay for it? Not by taxes, by debasing the currency further. The silver content collapsed to 50%. Think about the mechanics of this. Every time the emperor minted a new inferior coin and spent it into the economy, he was diluting the purchasing power of every existing coin held by a merchant, a widow, or a saver. It was a hidden tax, a transfer of wealth from the people who held the currency to the state that issued it. By the time we reached the mid-3rd century under emperors like Gallienus and Claudius Gothicus, the system had entered terminal velocity. The denarius, once the envy of the fee world, was now a copper slug washed in a thin layer of silver that rubbed off after a few exchanges. The silver content had fallen to 5%, then 2%, then barely a trace. Prices exploded. We have records of wheat prices from Egypt during this period. In the 2nd century, a measure of wheat cost roughly 8 drachmas. By the 3rd century, that same measure cost 120,000 drachmas. This wasn't just inflation. This was the disintegration of reality. Markets ceased to function. Soldiers refused to be paid in coin. They demanded payment in good salt, leather, gold. The complex trade networks that bound the empire together began to snap. A merchant in Gaul would not accept a coin from a merchant in Syria because he didn't trust the metal. The economy localized. It reverted to barter. The middle class, the shopkeepers, the artisans, the small landowners, was wiped out. They held their savings in the currency, and the currency evaporated. The wealthy, the senators, the generals, they owned land, they owned gold, they owned slaves. They were insulated. The gap between the ultra-rich and the desperate poor became an unbridgeable chasm. Then came Diocletian in 284 AD. He attempted to fix the chaos with the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. He tried to legislate the laws of arithmetic. He set price caps on over 1,000 goods, beef, grain, clothing, even labor rates. The penalty for violating the price controls was death. And what happened? Did prices stabilize? No goods disappeared from the market. Farmers refused to sell their grain at a loss. Shopkeepers closed their doors. The black market became the only market. The economy didn't just slow down. It stopped. Lactantius, a historian of the time, wrote that blood was shed for trifles and that nothing appeared for sale. The empire limped on, but it was a zombie. The freedom, the trade, the vitality, it was gone. The monetary rot had eaten the foundation. The chosen shortcut led directly to the collapse of the social order. Just like Rome, we must look at the second case study. Weimar, Germany. The year is 1914. Germany enters World War I. Like Nero, the German government faces a massive funding gap. They expect a quick victory. They choose not to finance the war through taxation, which would be unpopular and difficult. Instead, they suspend the convertibility of the mark to gold. They create the paper mark. They begin to borrow heavily, assuming they will pay off the debts with reparations from the defeated allies. The incentive is political survival. The mechanism is the printing press, but the war is lost, and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposes crushing reparations on Germany. 132 billion gold marks. Germany has been stripped of its industrial territories. It has no gold. It has no foreign currency. It has only one thing: the printing press at the Reichsbank. The tragedy of Weimar is not just the numbers. It is the speed. It shows how quickly a civilized, industrial, educated society can descend into madness when the money dies. In early 1921, the exchange rate was roughly 60 marks to $1. It was painful, but manageable. But the government kept printing to pay the workers in the occupied Ruhr Valley, to pay the welfare state, to pay the reparations. By mid-1922, the crack-up boom began. Confidence evaporated. People realized the money was a lie. The velocity of money exploded. As soon as you received a mark, you ran to the store to buy anything, a piano, a sack of coal, a book, anything that would hold value. By November 1923, $1 was worth 42 trillion marks. But these are just numbers. Let's look at the human cost. Imagine a university professor who had saved his entire life for a comfortable retirement. In 1919, his savings of 100,000 marks could buy a beautiful house in Berlin and support him for decades. By 1923, that entire life savings could not buy a cup of coffee. The intellectual class, the backbone of German culture, was proletarianized overnight. A factory worker would be paid at 11 a.m. He would throw his wages bundles of cash in a wheelbarrow to his wife, who was waiting at the factory gates. She would run to the bakery because by 12 p.m., the price of bread would double. If she waited until the evening, the money was worthless. There are stories of people ordering a coffee in a cafe. The price on the menu was 5,000 marks. By the time they finished drinking it, the waiter presented a bill for 8,000 marks. The price had risen while the coffee cooled. The social contract was shredded. Why work? Why save? Why follow the rules? Crime skyrocketed, prostitution became rampant as desperate families sold anything to survive. The values of thrift and prudence were mocked. The speculators, the borrowers, the people who had access to foreign currency or hard assets, they became the new kings. Hugo Stinnes, the inflation king, borrowed massive amounts of marks to buy up factories, mines, and newspapers, paying back the loans later with worthless paper. He owned a significant chunk of the German economy, while the average citizen starved. The psychological trauma of this period cannot be overstated. It destroyed the faith in democratic institutions. It created a vacuum of authority. It made the population desperate for order, for a strongman, for anyone who could promise stability. And we know exactly who walked through that door. The monetary collapse was the direct precursor to the political horror that followed. The arithmetic of the printing press paved the road to totalitarianism. Just like Weimar, we turn to the third case study, the British Empire. This is a slower, more subtle decline, but perhaps the most relevant to the American experience. In 1914, the British pound sterling was the undisputed king of global finance. Sound as a pound was not just a saying. It was a geopolitical fact. Trade was settled in London, but 2 world wars drained the British treasury. They borrowed heavily. From the United States, they sold off their overseas assets. By 1945, Britain was effectively bankrupt. It had tried to maintain the illusion of imperial power and a robust welfare state. The government wanted to build a new Jerusalem, free healthcare, nationalized industries, full employment. The incentive was noble. The arithmetic was impossible. To fund this, they relied on financial repression. They kept interest rates artificially low. They used capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country. They leaned on the Bank of England to accommodate the deficits. The result was a slow grinding stop-go cycle. Every time the economy grew, inflation would spike, the trade balance would worsen, and the pound would come under pressure. The government would have to slam on the brakes, raise taxes, or cut spending. Then, as unemployment rose, they would panic and pump money again. The defining moment came in November 1967. Prime Minister Harold Wilson was forced to devalue the pound from $280 to $240. This was a humiliation for a former superpower. But it was his speech that resonates today. He told the British public, "It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued." This was a technical truth, but a fundamental lie. The pound in the pocket had the same face value, but its purchasing power abroad had collapsed. Imported goods, food, fuel, raw materials became more expensive. The standard of living stagnated. The unions became militant, demanding higher wages to keep up with the inflation that the government was creating. Strikes paralyzed the country. The winter of discontent in the late 1970s saw garbage piling up in Leicester Square and bodies left unburied in Liverpool. The electricity ran on a 3-day week. The mighty British Empire had been reduced to the sick man of Europe. In 1976, the humiliation was complete. Great Britain, the conqueror of the globe, had to go hand in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. They had to accept humiliating conditions on their own fiscal policy. The currency had lost over 60% of its purchasing power in a generation. The middle class saw their pensions eroded. The best and brightest emigrated. The country was hollowed out, not by invasion, but by the slow, persistent mismanagement of the currency. The man, the successive. Chancellors and prime ministers chose the soft option of inflation over the hard option of restructuring until the market forced the restructure upon them. The pattern is unmistakable. Rome, Weimar, Britain. Different eras, different technologies, but the same human behavior, the same incentives, the same outcome. After analyzing these historical precedents, we can see that the pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1. The good money. The nation starts with sound money. Gold, silver, or a currency strictly pegged to a hard asset. There is fiscal discipline. The economy grows on productivity savings, and investment prosperity is real. This is Rome before Nero. This is America before 1913. Stage 2. The overextension. The nation becomes a superpower. It takes on obligations. It cannot afford foreign wars, domestic welfare programs, bureaucratic expansion. Expenditure begins to structurally exceed revenue. The deficit becomes a permanent feature, not an emergency measure. Stage 3. The turning point. The government faces a choice: austerity or inflation. Austerity means cutting benefits, reducing the military, and raising taxes. This is politically suicidal. Inflation means printing money, suppressing interest rates, and debasing the currency. This is politically convenient. The man enters the stage. He creates the mechanism: the Federal Reserve, the Reichsbank, the executive order. He severs the link between the currency and reality. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. This was the American turning point. Stage 4. The financialization. With easy money flowing, the economy shifts from production to speculation. Manufacturing declines because it is hard. Finance explodes because it is easy. Debt levels skyrocket. The stock market and real estate market decouple from the real economy. The rich get richer because they own the assets that are inflating. The poor get poorer because their wages cannot keep up with the cost of living. You see the rise of billionaires and the rise of homelessness simultaneously. Stage 5. The inflation instability. The cracks begin to show. Prices start to rise noticeably. The government blames greedy corporations, supply chains, or foreign adversaries. They manipulate the data. They change the definition of CPI. They assure the public it is transitory, but the people feel it at the grocery store. Social unrest begins. Strikes, protests, polarization. Stage 6. The trap. The central bank tries to fight inflation by raising rates, but the debt is now so high that the system cannot handle positive real interest rates. Something breaks. A bank failure, a sovereign debt crisis, a pension fund collapse. The central bank is forced to pivot. They have to print even more to patch the hole. They choose inflation over collapse. This is the doom loop. Stage 7. The reset. The currency loses trust. People flee into hard assets. The system is forced to restructure. A new currency is issued. A new peg is established. Debts are defaulted on or inflated away. Wealth is transferred on a massive scale. The cycle begins again. Just like Rome, just like Weimar, just like Britain, the United States is currently moving through these stages. We are not in stage 1. We are not in stage 2. Current data suggests we are oscillating between stage 5 and stage 6. Look at the signals. The U.S. national debt is compounding at a rate that defies mathematical sustainability. Interest payments on the debt are now one of the largest items in the federal budget, rivaling the defense budget. The manufacturing base has been hollowed out, replaced by a financialized service economy. Wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the 1920s. The political polarization is extreme. The trust in institutions is at historic lows. The man has done his work. The mechanism of the Federal Reserve, designed in 1913 and unleashed in 1971, has facilitated the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. It has allowed the government to spend without taxation. It has allowed Wall Street to speculate without risk. And the bill is being sent to Main Street in the form of inflation. Some economists argue that this time is different. They say the US dollar is the world reserve currency. They say there is no alternative. They say the exorbitant privilege allows America to defy the laws of gravity forever. This is the dangerous complacency of the late-stage empire. The British said the same thing about the sterling. The Romans said the same thing about the denarius. The laws of arithmetic do not care about American exceptionalism. The incentive for the rest of the world is changing. Nations are buying gold at record rates. Central banks are diversifying away from the dollar. The BRICS nations are building alternative payment rails. The world is preparing for the post-dollar era. The risk is not that the dollar disappears tomorrow. The risk is a slow, agonizing loss of purchasing power, punctuated by sharp crisis. Under these constraints, the rational move for the state is to tighten control. This brings us to the Endgames. History suggests three possible outcomes. First, the controlled decline. This is the British path. A slow managed reduction in the standard of living, decades of stagnation. High taxes, capital controls, the gradual erosion of wealth. The government manages the descent, keeping the peace, but stifling the prosperity. Second, the chaotic collapse. This is the Weimar or Soviet path, hyperinflation, institutional failure, a complete breakdown of the social order. This usually leads to authoritarianism, as the population demands order at any cost. Third, the reset and restructure. This is the most likely modern outcome. Bretton Woods, too. The introduction of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, a programmed currency that allows for direct stimulus, negative interest rates, and total surveillance. It solves the debt problem by redefining the money. It prevents bank runs by banning cash. It is the ultimate tool of the man. It completes the project started in 1913. The pattern is set. The arithmetic is in motion. The precedents are clear. The only variable is timing and pain. If you understand this, you are already ahead of 99% of the population. You cannot stop the tide, but you can build a boat. You can educate yourself on financial history. You can reduce your dependence on the fragility of the system. You can focus on resilience, on real skills, on tangible value. Pay attention to the data, not the headlines. Watch the liquidity. Watch the bond market. The story is being written in real time. Subscribe to follow the narrative as it unfolds. Prepare your mind. Prepare your household. The history books are open. Make sure you're on the right side of the page.